Welcome to week 4. In the past week, we looked at the knowledge base for NAPs. This week, we will be exploring the specific types of adaptation actions in the agricultural sectors and how to identify, appraise, and prioritize among them. We have arrived on our second island. We know that climate change brings many risks. We also know that climate change adaptation is the way to prepare agriculture systems to face these risks. If we go back to the map with the LEG technical guidelines, we see that the first step in implementing adaptation plans covered under element C is prioritizing adaptation actions. Before we get to what prioritization of adaptation options is all about, let's take a step back and understand how these options fit into the larger scheme of climate change adaptation, specifically for the agriculture sectors. There are 6 key areas of adaptation measures in agriculture. Let's go through these together. Number 1, building resilience of livelihoods. These actions support those who are poor, vulnerable, and food insecure. Social protection programs, disaster risk reduction initiatives, addressing gender-differentiated vulnerabilities are different measures to increase resilience of livelihoods. Another way of increasing climate resilience of rural communities is providing decent rural employment both on and off the farm. This would also decrease unplanned migration and food insecurity. SDG 1, Ending Poverty, pays special attention to this area of adaptation measures. Number 2, building resilience of agricultural systems. These actions take place at the farm and production level, throughout the supply chain, and at different landscape levels. Let's hear from Anne Motte, the Livestock Policy Officer from FAO. Anne will share some examples of adaptation actions within a specific agricultural system, livestock. She will talk about the adaptation actions for feed and forage resources.
So I think the first very important step is to assess the impact. And the impacts of climate change on systems that are so diverse are obviously diverse. So is it a question of feed, of drought in forage, for example, or is it a question of animal diseases? Climate change can influence and change the patterns of animal diseases through the distribution of vectors or change the vulnerability of livestock to diseases. So first you need to have a right assessment of the problem, and then in the case of feed and forage resources, for example, you need to have to establish feed balances. You need to know where is the feed and forages missing, and where can you find additional resources, what kind of safety nets you can put in place, insurance schemes, and so on.
So, some measures of livestock adaptation are establishing feed balances and putting in place safety nets and insurance schemes. Let's move on. Number 3. The third key area focuses on managing genetic resources. Did you read the lecture notes for week 2? If so, you will remember that they underpin the need to conserve genetic resources and identify genetic traits which are key for adaptation. For action examples, skip back to week 2, but later. Number 5. Investing in systems to assess risks, vulnerabilities, and adaptation options. Here, we are reminded of the familiar information and knowledge tools: improved data collection, vulnerability and impact assessments, and more effective climate information and early warning systems. All of these can be adaptation options in themselves. Number 6. Enabling adaptation through policies and institutions. You can imagine that adaptation options need supportive policies and institutions. Think, for example, of global markets and trade. They can play a stabilizing role for food prices and provide alternative food options for negatively affected regions. Appropriate policies are needed to enhance the contribution of markets and trade to food security. You thought we skipped number 4. Nope, we have it right here. Number 4, investing in resilient agricultural development. We need targeted investments to increase the resilience of agroecosystems. These investments can also enhance socioeconomic resilience through programs on social protection, agricultural market governance, insurance, and early warning systems. One specific adaptation measure in this area is investing in diversification. Diversification can be done in many ways. Farmers may diversify their crops by choosing a different combination of crops, or they may diversify their labor to non-farm activities such as wage labor or self-employment and household work. What are the drivers of diversification at the smallholder farm level? FAO studies have found that farm households adopt different levels and types of diversification depending on how exposed they have been to climate variability. Basically, previous experience of weather shocks can provoke diversification. Diversification helps farmers to spread out risks and reduce the impact on household consumption. In all of these adaptation measures, there are also complementary benefits to consider, such as reducing gender inequality, mitigation efforts, etc. A well-designed intervention in the agricultural sectors would cut across the usual distinction between climate change adaptation and mitigation. Needless to say, diversification or adopting any other adaptation action is a complex process. Even when they are perfectly designed, there are significant adoption barriers to overcome. Let's hear from Astrid Agostini, Senior Natural Resources Officer from FAO, about the different barriers that may come up.
We know that many good practices already exist, but there are very many barriers to adoption. Some of those barriers include, for instance, information. People don't really know what the likely impacts will be on climate change in a particular area, and also what are the specific options that have already been tried and tested and that can be upscaled in that particular context. A second very important barrier is tenure security. Without having security to invest, that long-term investments can really reap benefits for those who are undertaking those investments, it's very difficult to bring about that type of change. So investing and creating tenure security is a key element to bring about transformational change. Another area that's particularly tricky, especially for smallholders and vulnerable households, is access to credit. They don't have the opportunity to think long-term, to take credit in order to invest into what may be future benefits. And lastly, but not very importantly, there is also the key role of social capital. Especially small farmers, poor farmers in isolated areas can often suffer from the fact that individual actions cannot bring about the change. They need to have a way to bring about collective action in order to upscale both the way that they access services, but also the way they market produce, the way that they can transform the way they do productive systems in particular areas. And so it is also the creation of greater social capital at the local level that can bring about transformational change.
We have more examples of adaptation actions in agriculture in the case studies this week. Also, did you watch the episode on the Philippines? What did you think about Ephemia's choice of raising goats as a diversification strategy? We mentioned so many different adaptation options, and they all sounded so good. And that can be a problem. In the next video, we will tackle this very problem that decision makers face. That is, choosing what to invest in and implement. But first, let's quickly go through what we just covered. There are 6 main areas in which adaptation options can be classified. These correspond to the different needs of the agricultural sectors and the risks faced by them. We spoke about diversification as an option for adaptation and some of the barriers that smallholders face. You must be progressing with your peer assessment building blocks. Here is a reminder of the upcoming deadlines. Do not forget to check out the lecture notes for this week. See you in the next video.